At the World Economic Forum Congress, we're now in conversation with one of the world's leading strategic thinkers, Fareed Zakaria. Welcome. Also with me is India Today Group's Editor-in-Chief, Arun Puri. Mr. Puri.
Fareed, you're a renowned international expert. A lot of changes are happening in the world. This whole power matrix in the world is changing. The America first, China assertive or aggressive, whichever way you look at it. Russia playing its own game. And India, of course, trying to now make a claim for some kind of global presence. How do you give us a wrap on how do you see these changing power equations in the world?
It's very interesting, Arun. Right now it feels like we're in a period where there's a great disjuncture between the economics and the politics. So economically, we are in a period of synchronous global growth. Every major part of the world is growing. This has not happened for decades. I mean, even when you think back to the 03, 04, 05, 06 period, remember Japan was not growing. That's 10-15% of the world economy. Now everyone is growing. India, China, the United States, Europe. Japan has had 6 quarters of successive growth. So the conditions seem fairly benign in terms of investment. Stocks are up, bonds are up, commercial real estate is up, residential real estate. I mean, I'm talking globally now. I know there are pockets here and there. And yet, there is a great deal of unease because of precisely what you put your finger on, I think. There's a sense that underneath this benign economic reality is a shifting geopolitical reality. The United States is retreating in some ways. Europe remains inactive. China is asserting itself, but as you see, powers. It's not just Russia, it's Saudi Arabia. The Middle East has essentially become a place, for example, where Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Russia are playing a complicated game with the United States, more in a supportive role than before. What does all this mean as China starts asserting itself? And I think that things haven't settled yet. It's a period of great flux, but there's a great deal of uneasiness as to whether, when will the other shoe drop? And in this context, I don't get the sense that India has figured out its game. I think that China has figured out its game. I think Russia has figured out its game. But with India, you kind of have this feeling of wanting a role without knowing really what that is, what is the strategy, what is the purpose. And you saw that in a way in Prime Minister Modi's speech, which was fine. I mean, he said good things, but it lacked a kind of single strategic message. And I think that that's because we don't have a single strategy.
Is that related to the lack of economic clout? Is there a connection between, people listen to China because of the size of its economy and the role it plays in terms of world economy. Is the lack of economic clout one of the reasons why we can't really have a strong role globally? No,
I think it's not. I think honestly, of course, you get a bigger voice and more respect if you have 10, 20, 15% of the global GDP. And so certainly one thing India should do is to focus on that. So China did that. China focused on its economy and development and was very quiet on foreign policy. Actually subcontracted foreign policy to America. Said whatever the Americans do is fine with us. We are just developing. The Russians take a very different approach. They take what power they have and try to punch above their weight by saying we're going to have ideas, we're going to have influence, we're going to engage. And it's not so much that I think that India needs to do one or the other, but I think India doesn't know which it wants. Some days it seems as though India wants to be a global player. Some days it seems that it just wants to focus on development. And I think that the more important issue is that India has to decide in this context of the world you very correctly described, what power balance and what power configuration best serves India's interests? What should India be pushing for? What trends? The rise of China is the fundamental fact in geopolitics in the world today. What is India's response to it? I find it very difficult to find Indian officials almost don't want to think about the problem rather than to provide an answer.
चल ढोल बजा चल शंख उठा चल ढोल बजा चल शंख उठा चल ढोल बजा चल गला खोल ये गाना गा सब खुशियां मनाने वाले हैं अच्छे दिन आने वाले हैं सब खुशियां मनाने वाले हैं अच्छे दिन आने वाले हैं कोई छोटा कोई गम ना गिला सच होने वाले हैं अच्छे दिन आने वाले हैं सब खुशियां मनाने वाले हैं अच्छे दिन आने वाले हैं अब जीती है प्रजा अब आएगा मजा अब कस ले कमर और लहरा ले ध्वजा लहरा ले ध्वजा लहरा ले ध्वजा लहरा ले ध्वजा ओ लहरा ले ध्वजा
Well, good evening and welcome to the Centre for Independent Studies. My name's Tom Switzer. I'm the Executive Director of CIS. For those of you who don't know much about CIS, we're a leading research public policy organisation. We've been based in Sydney for more than 40 years. We're primarily committed to the cause of classical liberalism, so we propose free market solutions as a way of making Australia a better and freer place. We've also over the years delved into international relations, and for the best part of 10 years we focused quite a bit on China, and that's completely understandable given that China is our largest trade partner. But India matters too. It's increasingly seizing the Australian imagination, and for good reasons. If you look at those free market reforms that were put in place in India in the early 1990s, they've paid great dividends. Poverty has been coming down dramatically, and growth rates are now skyrocketing. The last quarter, we had 7.4% annual growth in India. China had 6.5%. Now, to the extent that India's economy continues to expand, some economists think it will surpass China in annual growth, and as a result, it will continue to reduce poverty. Its rapid development means there's a huge hunger for Australian resources and uranium, and you all know about the controversy dealing with Adani in Queensland. And the rise of China increases the strategic appeal of a well-armed and increasingly prosperous China, as Fareed Zakaria, you just heard there from CNN, make clear. Meanwhile, India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, he is still dominant in Delhi. He came to power, as you know, in a landslide in May 2014. For the first time since India's independence in 1947, the BJP party gained a clear majority. So what did that political earthquake mean for India and its place in the world? Modi's economic reform agenda. What does Modi mean for Australia and the world generally? Well, I can't think of a better Western expert to talk about India than our next guest today. Sadanand Dhume is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. He's also the South Asia columnist for the Wall Street Journal editorial page, for mine, the best paper in the world. And he's the author of My Friend the Fanatic, Travels with a Radical Islamist. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sadanand Dhume.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction, Tom. I have never been to CIS before, but reading about it and listening to your description, I feel right at home as someone who works at the American Enterprise Institute and writes for the Wall Street Journal editorial page. We very much share the same set of values and believe that free markets and free people make this world a better place. Now, I have limited time, and the question is very broad. Is Modi a transformative figure? And the obvious sort of response to that is, in what way? Is he a transformative figure in electoral politics? Is he a transformative figure in the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party? Is he a transformative figure in terms of Indian foreign policy? Is he a transformative figure in terms of India's experiment with secularism and pluralism? And I could give you a different answer to each of these questions, but I'm not going to answer any of those four questions here in my remarks, though we may be able to get into them in Q&A, simply because my time is limited. And instead, I'm going to focus on a question of which I've paid very close attention to over the years, which is Modi a transformative figure for the Indian economy? And to my mind, in the end, all the other answers, or most of the other answers, flow to a large degree from the answer to this question. My thesis, and I'll lay it out here and explain more in detail as we go along, is that when it comes to Asia's third largest economy, Narendra Modi so far has not shown evidence of being a transformative figure. To a large extent, he has mirrored the same collectivist socialist thinking that has marked Indian politics and Indian economic policy. And when you compare the economic policies that have been put in place in India with the high-performing economies of Northeast Asia, I think that those of us who had expected his election in 2014 to produce compelling structural reform have been proven, at least so far, to have been over-optimistic. So I'm going to divide my talk very quickly into 4 parts. The first is, why did many of us believe that Modi would be a transformative figure for the economy? The second is, how has he not been transformative? What are the major things that have not been done? The third is, what did we get wrong in our analysis? And fourth, very briefly, what are the implications for India and the world that flow from this? So the first part, why did many of us, including me, believe that Modi would be a transformative figure for the Indian economy? Well, for starters, he campaigned in 2013 and 2014. Really, his election campaign was focused on development. And many of the slogans that he rolled out during that election campaign kind of allowed us to conjure up the image of a committed, market-friendly reformer. For instance, he went on the campaign trail and said that he believed in maximum governance and minimum government. He promised to replace the red tape of government with a red carpet for business. He stated that the government has no business doing business. And all these, of course, for those of us who believe in free markets and believe in a market-oriented economy, conjured up exactly the right image. Secondly, there was the Gujarat model. Narendra Modi was the chief minister of Gujarat from the end of 2001 to 2014. And I think, in fairness, he did a very good job as chief minister. He was proactive in attracting foreign direct investment. Gujarat enjoyed nearly double-digit growth rates for over a decade. Its agricultural economy grew very rapidly. And over his time in Gujarat, he acquired a reputation for being India's most business-friendly chief minister and also an efficient administrator. And I think this was entirely well-deserved. He'd also developed the reputation for taking politically tough but economically sensible decisions. For example, famously in Gujarat, he campaigned in one of his state elections where he refused to promise free electricity to farmers, even though that's what the opposition was promising. And he said, no, he was not going to do that, that farmers would have to pay for their electricity, but he would provide them reliable electricity, which was sort of seen as an act of, and was in fact an act of political courage. There was also a sense that in terms of his own thinking, that in many ways he had outgrown the economic thinking of the Hindu nationalist group, the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, of which he is a product. So, for example, in 2013, he gave a famous speech in Delhi at a College of Economics and Commerce, where he bemoaned the decline of India's textile manufacturing over the years. He spoke of the success of countries such as South Korea and Taiwan. He said that he dreamed of an India which would be where companies would be marked by skill, speed, and scale. And all this, for those of you who have followed India and Indian politics carefully, came as quite a sharp and refreshing departure from the usual rhetoric that we had heard from Indian politicians over the decades. He had also surrounded himself with pro-market reformers. Arun Shourie, for instance, was the minister in the late 1990s and early 2000s who had led India's drive to privatize loss-making public sector firms, state-owned firms. And the great trade economist Jagdish Bhagwati at Columbia University, who had critiqued India's socialist turn as early as the 1960s and the state planning, was also one of his supporters. So he had the right sort of people around him too. Fast forward to 2018. Now, it's not my case, I don't want to overstate my case, it's not my case that the government has done nothing. It has done some good things. It's true that the GDP growth rate is over 7%, which is, reasonable, though we must admit, though it's coming off a very, very low base. So the comparisons with China are not entirely fair, because at the same level of per capita income, China was clocking double-digit growth rates regularly. Nonetheless, 7%, about 7% is a reasonable growth rate, which is what we're expected at in the coming year. He has been very successful in foreign direct investment. In 2016, India attracted $60 billion of FDI, which is the highest ever. He has pushed through at least one important structural reform, which is the goods and services tax. It is not a perfect goods and services tax. It is very complicated, both in terms of its structure and in terms of how one has to file. Nonetheless, I think it is an important reform, and that over the years, if it is simplified, it would be of tremendous benefit to the economy. He's put in place a bankruptcy law, which was long overdue. And more recently, the government appears to have moved towards breaking a 50-year state monopoly on coal. So I'm not saying that the government has done nothing. Nonetheless, if you look at the economic debate in India for the last 25 years, since the advent of economic reforms in 1991, there have been several important reforms that have been on the agenda, which the previous government, the Congress-led government, had not been able to make headway on for 10 long years between 2004 and 2014. There was a hope that the BJP government under Modi, with his large majority, the first single-party majority in 30 years, would have been able to make headway on, and in fact, he has not made headway. So let me give you a quick rundown of those. The most important, I'd say, is labor laws. It's a state subject, but the BJP is, but the center really can set the tone in terms of these laws, and these again go back to Nehru and Indira Gandhi in the early decades after independence, which effectively made, these were laws that were put in place ostensibly to help workers, but effectively made India one of the hardest places, for example, to open and to have large-scale manufacturing. And I'll give you just one statistic here. Farid Zakaria and others, and Tom spoke about China. In China, 90% of textile firms employ 100 workers or more. In India, 90% of textile firms employ 10 workers or less. And that contrast, that single figure, will tell you in a nutshell what has been wrong with labor laws. The labor laws, of course, have not been fixed. It doesn't seem like there's any signs, any movement, any significant movement in that direction. On land, the Columbia University economist had criticized a land bill which had been put in place by the previous government, and he had said that that bill had made it harder to acquire land for industry in India than it was to acquire land on Mars. To the Modi government's credit, they tried to push reforms here early on in 2015, but they faced political opposition. They quickly backed out, and we have seen no real talk of fixing those problematic land laws in more than 3 years. In privatization, the Prime Minister said that the government has no business doing business. Right now, the number of privatizations we've seen in nearly 4 years is exactly 0. There is some talk of privatizing Air India. If that happens, it would be a great thing. But so far, we have not privatized even one loss-making firm. Banking, 70% of India's banking sector remains state-owned. There have been some sort of cosmetic moves here and there to tighten up management. No structural reform, no real move to change the nature of the banking system, which is one of the most efficient. And we're finding with a recent scam involving a diamond trader, also extremely corrupt. In terms of tariffs and trade, after 25 years of liberalization, we have begun to see India move in the other direction. A bunch of tariffs were increased in December, and then in the most recent budget in February, again, it was marked by an increase in import tariffs. So we're seeing for the first time, and it's too early to comment on this definitively, but we are seeing potentially for the first time since the advent of economic reforms in 1991, a trend line in terms of tariffs that is moving away from from lowering tariffs and greater liberalization to putting up protective barriers again. So all of these are sort of, nor has the Modi government successfully reversed some of the worst decisions of the previous government. For instance, the previous government in 2012 put in place something called the retroactive tax, which basically allowed authorities to kind of go back decades and slap taxes on firms. This was universally criticized by economists and technocrats. The Modi government has not done anything to change that. That still remains on the books. Similarly, in taxation more generally, there was a sense that the previous government had unleashed what the BJP itself criticized as tax terrorism, which was essentially giving tax inspectors way too much power. I would say that tax terrorism has not decreased. If anything, it has increased. And then, of course, we had the decision of 2016, which was a spectacular blunder by the government itself, where it put in place the policy known as demonetization, where essentially overnight they nuked 86% of India's currency by value. This was touted as an anti-corruption measure. It was certainly electorally popular, but the overwhelming majority of economists think that it was a terrible idea. And the only people who had suggested this before it actually was implemented were an assorted group of RSS ideologues and yoga gurus. So, going back, what did we get wrong, right? Or what did I get wrong, right? So, in the 2 days before the 2014 election, I wrote a Wall Street Journal column, and the headline was "Indians Vote for Hope." And the reason was all those reasons why I said why we were optimistic about Modi taking control of the economy. The first mistake, of course, was that we took the slogans at face value. In Modi's case, maximum governance, minimum government was not any kind of Thatcherite vision. All it meant was that all decisions are going to be concentrated in the Prime Minister's office. It did not mean that the market would play a much greater role in the Indian economy. We misread the ideological evolution of the RSS. Now, this is a complex matter, and I know there are internal debates within the organization. But the joke about the RSS's economic philosophy, the Hindu nationalist organization that's at the roots of the BJP, the joke about their economics used to be that RSS economics is Marxism plus cow. Now, there was a hope that Modi, because he was coming from the industrialized state of Gujarat, had transcended that. And it's certainly true that he has in some ways. For instance, he's very forward-leaning on FDI, and that has been one of his success stories. But I think those of us who felt that that old way of thinking that was embedded in this grassroots organization had been completely overcome were over-optimistic. It is still a factor in Indian politics. It is still a factor in the decision-making of the government. We also overestimated the role of his advisors. It turned out that some of the more important people, such as Shori, who had led the privatization drive, were simply not taken into government. And others who had a reputation for being economic liberals were taken into government, but we don't see the fingerprints of their ideas very clearly on government policy. Finally, there was a role played by the opposition, and I think this is increasingly important when we kind of chart out India's economic future, which is that the attacks from Modi effectively come from the left. So when he did, for instance, try to liberalize the land acquisition laws, he was immediately attacked by the Congress party with a jibe where he was accused of representing the people who dress up in suits. And when you have a situation, when you have a political environment where the attacks only come from the left, sometimes it makes sense to tack to the left, and that's exactly what this government has done. So what does all this mean then? And I'd say that it's an open question. I mean, there is no doubt that if you take a long view, if you take a 40-year view, India has done well. It has grown at over 6% a year for close to 40 years. If you take a approximately 25-year view, if you go back to economic reforms of 1991, there's no question that India has been one of the bright spots in the world economy and one of the best performing economies. So I want to put this in perspective. But the question really is, can India get to the next level without these economic reforms that we've been talking about for a long time: labor, land, not banking, privatization of loss-making of state-owned firms. And what gives this a kind of urgency is the fact is India's demographic profile. Now, just to stay in the same place, India needs to create 12 million new jobs a year. That's 1 million jobs a month just to stay in the same place. It's no secret that it is not creating even a fraction of that number of jobs. If you don't believe me, just have a conversation with any Indian taxi driver in Sydney or Melbourne or Perth and ask them about the situation in their hometown and how easy it is to get a job. And the answer is it's not. And what we've seen over the past few years is protest movements breaking out in parts of India, which are unusual because they are protest movements that are being led by members of traditionally dominant and prosperous castes. So we've had the Jats who've been protesting in Haryana. We've had the Marathas who've been protesting in Maharashtra. We've had the Patels who've been protesting in Gujarat. And these are all dominant groups. And if you thread this together, what is going on is that even groups that have been traditionally prosperous and politically powerful feel that employment opportunities are not being generated. So to me, the jury is still out on whether India is going to catch up with China. But I think that we have to at least start thinking seriously in terms of the Indian political system not being able to deliver the kind of market-friendly reforms that many economists think are necessary. So Deng Xiaoping used to joke about, he used to talk about, not joke, he used to talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is essentially capitalism. Unfortunately, socialism with Indian characteristics really is socialism. I'll leave it at that.
Sadanand, thank you very much. Now's as good a time as any to acknowledge a few people here in the audience. We have with us here this evening from the Indian Consul General, Mr. S.K. Verma. Thank you very much, Mr. Verma. We also have here Damien Tudorhope, who is the State Liberal MP for Epping. Epping is in northwest Sydney. It's home to a pretty significant segment of Indian Australians. Thank you, Damien. And we also have here in the audience Mr. Stephen Loosley, who's a former Labor Senator and President of the ALP. India is a bipartisan issue, and we at the CIS are non-political, so it's great to have a Labor and a Liberal here in the audience. Now to our panel. We've heard from Sadanand. We're going to talk about what he had to raise with our following guests: Bailesh Singh, Manoj Shariwan, and Rahul Jetri. And I'm going to moderate it. Sadanand, we heard earlier from Fareed Zakaria from the Washington Post and CNN, arguably India's most prominent Western commentator, apart from yourself. He made the point that the central fact of international relations is the rise of China. And what's India's response? And he's perplexed. He's Indian. He spent the first 20 years of his life in India. He focuses on India a lot. He doesn't know what India's response is. Is it a global power under Modi, or is it primarily focused on domestic affairs?
So I don't think this should be viewed in either or terms. I think that there's no question that India aspires to be a bigger power. The language that has been used in the last few years is that it aspires to be a leading power in the world. And I certainly think that the Prime Minister's diplomacy has been quite successful to the degree that he has sort of invigorated the foreign policy apparatus. He has reached out to global leaders and formed personal bonds. You saw a very robust Indian response to a Chinese intrusion into Bhutan last year. But so I would, generally speaking, give the government fairly high marks in terms of how it has executed foreign policy. But the question that sort of I come back to is that in the end, China has emerged as a global power because China, since Deng Xiaoping, has got its economy right. And it's not clear to me.
So mainly the free market reforms from
Yes.
the early 1990s, correct?
Exactly. So right, so Deng Xiaoping famously said that it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice, right? But the philosophy behind an act like demonetization is that I really do care about the color, or not only of the cat but also of the mouse and what kind of. So I think India, and it's a fascinating thing that in some ways the Chinese, who are the heirs to the thinking of Lenin and Mao, have been able to pivot and embrace the market much more successfully than India, even though India does have a sort of tradition going back to British days of much more familiarity with market-based institutions, for instance. And so my concern is that if the politics of India does not produce the reforms that are necessary, then no matter how well you try to execute your foreign policy, you're simply not going to have the diplomatic and military resources to compete with a behemoth like China.
Well, let's turn to domestic politics. Some commentators, Rahul, will lump Modi with Trump and Brexit to demonstrate evidence that this is a guy who's a classic populist who's just tapping into widespread anxieties felt across middle India. Let's get your reaction to something that Salman Rushdie told Fareed Zakaria on CNN a few months ago, quote, "If you don't have a firm grip on the truth, then you lay yourself open to a phenomena like Trump, like Modi in India, like Brexit. There's a whole range of these phenomena which I think all come from the same damaged reality that we're living in."
Look, Farid, Salman Rushdie can have his opinion about what he thinks about Modi or Trump, and for that matter, anybody else. And the fact of the matter is, Modi has caught the imagination of India. And the reason for that is his proven record of 12 years of governance in Gujarat. Not only that, the aspiring India at this point of time, where the total population, 70% of the total population is in the age group of 15 to 35, that has a lot of hope. But the unfortunate part which has happened in India is for the last 60 odd years, the politics, the institutions which have been built by the Congress party, they have been so hard to demolish to get any reform through. What Sadanand was saying about that land acquisition bill, because Modi had the majority in the lower house, which he can get through, but as soon as you move to the Senate, what you call here, and the upper house in India, they get blocked. In 2014, BJP was ruling only in 5 states. Right now, BJP, after Sunday's election results coming out, they are ruling out of 28 states in 21 states. So after 2019, all those issues which are basically pro-market friendly and all the reforms which have been held back because they all get blocked at the Senate level, where you have to do deals and try to push them through in a different way, they will all be a thing of the past. Just to the government's credit, what they've done, you can talk about globalization and India's role in the world, but unless and until you are domestically strong, it is not going to happen. So what Modi did when he came to power, in the last 4 years, they have opened 320 million bank accounts for the poor of the people. So right now, the subsidy straight away goes to a poor person's bank account. Apart from that, the demonetization, which people say that has been a failure, and in fact, if you look at all that money, which was the black money, has entirely come into the banking sector. Now, the government can actually look for who has had the money. And now, they can just go after the people looking at how they have acquired that money. The new rule which is coming about non-declared property, because a lot of the everywhere in the world, a lot of money which is laundered, always get laundered in real estate, most of the times. So the new law which is coming about, clearing all that in just terms of on non-declared property, that is coming to get enforced now. We understand, being pro-market and being supporter of BJP right from day one, we understand it's been a tough road. And the unfortunate part which has been is, when politics is played at every single point, for no, irrespective of which country you come from. That is what stalls the growth of the country. About China, China started its journey in 1980. India started a bit later. And then there were all these corruption issues, all this money siphoned, and the constant threat of terrorism, which actually takes India back every time, where a lot of companies, they were feeling that they can't invest money in India. In Mumbai, we had attacks everywhere. So those things has basically stopped a lot of stuff. But right now, the silver lining is, BJP has come to power in 21 states out of 28. Next time when the Senate elections are going to happen, they will have maturity. 2019, Modi is definitely going to come back, and that will basically kickstart the whole thing. And sorry, last point about the budget this year, which people are saying is protectionist. Everywhere in the world, all the leaders are basically going for protection now. What happened in America? Trump has put a stop on immigrants. What's happening up here? Labour Party is against Adani. They are trying to do something up here. So everywhere in the world, all the leaders, Brexit happened. So these are the issues. Being election year for Modi, he had to make sure that he comes back in power, take everybody along, and next time when they come back, they will have much better maturity to do the right thing.
And Manoj, let me bring you in here, because the conventional wisdom, I think, is a bit like Raul there, that we all know that the Gandhi-Nehru dynasty was front and center of Indian politics for decades, possibly going back a century. Rahul Gandhi, the current opposition leader of the left of centre Congress party, a son, grandson, great-grandson of prime ministers, he's on the political back foot, and there is this consensus that the BJP is on the cusp of wiping out the Congress party. Your response?
Yeah, I don't think so. This is correct, because Gandhi, definitely they were in power for many years, but that's all because of India as a democratic country. People voted for them. People liked them, and they did a lot of revolution. I mean, if I go back to when India was free, that was in 1947, we were one of the poorest country. And our life expectancy, if I talk about health, that was about what, 40 years, 35, 40 years. That was, and we were actually importers of all the food grains. We were sort of getting a lot of international aid. So now look at now, after till 2014 or 2017 or 18, if you talk, our economy is the sixth largest economy in terms of GDP. So that's a transformation. That's what people voted for. So Gandhi dynasty, yes, they were in power because they did that. They made India a modern country, and they did a lot of these transformations. That's why people keep voting them, the people keep voting them. And the other thing is, people rejected the opposition parties every time.
But your critics might say that India was in a pretty bad economic way in 2014. That's why there was resounding support for BJP.
That's a lot of. Is that for me or?
No, for you.
Yeah. He was about to talk. So I think if you look at 2014 election, Sadanand has already sort of mentioned a lot that people voted for a sort of a hope. A lot of falsehood was spread in throughout all the campaign. I mean, that was the highlight, and the whole campaign was sort of run by a lot of crony capitalism companies. So a lot of lies were spread, and that's why probably Congress couldn't really sort of resist that. So probably we lost the election. I mean, that's a fact. And where is the hope? I mean, where is the transformation? Are we talking about this topic today? I think I'm not even convinced. So I mean, we're talking about transformation, whether Modi is a transformation leader. We're talking about that. So we should have talked that when he became a prime minister 4 years back. Now we all know the facts. Where is the transformation? And Sadanand has already sort of mentioned a lot of points. Where is the transformation? So there is no real point of talking this topic, I think. The transformation should have talked 6 months.
Okay. Well, let me bring Bellish in here and ask the question. Let me ask Bellish the question. I mean, Gandhi and Nehru are giants of Indian politics, but do you think that dynastic politics is a thing of the past?
Well, to be honest, the way Manoj explained, people voted for Congress in past so many decades, but the way, and he rightly said that India is a democratic country, but the way I see it, and most Indians see it, is it is kind of a dictatorial concentration of power on top of a democratic country. Why I say this is because if you see the way this dynasty, Nehru dynasty or Gandhi dynasty, has been controlling the whole power within Congress, has been quite dictatorial. Generation after generation, after Nehru, let me complete. Nehru, and then Indira Gandhi, and then Rajiv Gandhi, and then Sonia Gandhi, and then Rahul Gandhi. Now, in recent elections, there were no transparent elections, and Rahul Gandhi was put on this position without any transparency, without any elections. Now, if you talk about democracy, if you talk about participation, then it has to be reflected in the party itself. Now, yes, India is a democratic country, and it has been electing Congress for last few decades because of very able opposition. But last few decades, if you see, the steady growth of BJP, and now if you can say from 2014 to 2018, BJP has grown from 7 states to 20 states. And Congress has declined from 13 states to 3 states. What does it reflect? Indians are sick and tired of this dynasty politics. Indians are sick and tired of continuous hope, false hope, that Nehru gave this slogan, Garibi Hatao, which translates remove poverty. Then his daughter, Indira Gandhi, she also gave same slogan. Rajiv Gandhi gave same slogan. And now, four generations, they are giving same slogans, that Garibi Hatao means remove poverty. But the thing is, Congress relies on India being poor.
So then, just quickly, just so the Indians then are a bit like the Americans. They're sick and tired of dynastic politics. So no more Bush, no more Clinton, no more Gandhi, no more Nehru.
No more corruption.
You're responsible for that.
No more corruption, which was product of Congress. Yeah.
Let me tell my friend Balesh that in this government, Modi's government, out of let's say 100 cabinet ministers, 30% of them have dynasty background. This is a fact.
Okay.
This is not my estimate. Let me tell. Now that is 30% has a dynastic background, or they are pursuing this dynasty politics. So that is 30%. So they can't actually talk about that.
No, I can
explain let me finish. I'm not finished yet. Sorry. So that is
like we're in India here watching one of those Q&A shows.
That is Modi's cabinet ministry. This is a fact. This is all in public domain. You can research it. Let me finish it. Now apart from that, there are few chief ministers of BJP government who has got a dynastic background. Vasundhara Raje is absolutely dynastic. Her son is a dynast. His son is in politics. Brother, sister, everybody is in politics. If you talk about Raman Singh, who is another chief minister of one of the BJP government, he got a dynastic background. His son is a MLA or MP or something. Now we talk about any of them. There are a lot of other examples. I won't really elaborate it, but there are a lot of examples. So where is the dynasty? What are they really talking about? I can't understand that. How can you talk? And the other thing is, Congress is a democratic party. There is an election happens for president of Congress. That election happens. Anybody can contest.
So Rahul Gandhi was selected by election?
Yes, that's definitely product. You go and check Election Commission website. There is a process.
Okay, no,
anybody can contest election.
Quick response.
So there is a democratic setup. Yes, leaders of Congress like dynasty. The leader of Congress like Gandhi family.
Thanks for that. Thank you.
The leader of Congress, whoever they vote, that's all public domain. So there is no real sort of discussion on that.
How Modi is clearing up dynasty is this. And what do we mean by dynasty? Dynasty means a son or daughter, whosoever, when he or she is imposed on people without their mandate, just because he's part of that family. That is dynasty. Now, I'll give you one example of how bureaucracy and how the whole governance is being run by Modi is every OSD is kind of a very a person who actually runs whole ministry behind the minister. Modi has placed a rule from the day one when he assumed office that no relative, no close associative or friend can be OSD of any minister, including the ex-party president Rajnath Singh. Modi himself rejected a number of OSD requests from all BJP ministers. So much so, forget about dynasty of like being imposing any minister or being imposing any senior official. He is not even allowing OSD of any minister, so that because that was the root cause of corruption, and that is the reason why, as Mr. Dhume has explained, where's the reform. More than 75%, and head of the World Bank noticed this, more than 75% corruption has dropped in top level of governance. And these are the reforms, and this is the reason why outcome of when you clear dynasty politics.
Now, Sadanand, let's turn to Modi himself. In January, as we heard earlier, he was in Davos and he championed globalization and warned about the power of protectionism. But as you've pointed out here this evening, in his most recent budget a few weeks ago, this was a soak-the-rich, protectionist strongman of the sort familiar in many poor countries. How do you account for the two Modis, but also why hasn't he used this huge mandate that he won in 2014 to put in place the kind of free market reforms many people had anticipated?
Yeah, thanks. That's a terrific question. I'm going to quickly jump in and disagree with both of them on the dynasty point first. See, the crucial difference is this. And in the Congress party, the top job is reserved for a member of the family. In the BJP, that is not so. So in that sense, the BJP is more evolved in terms of this. But it's certainly true, as Manoj pointed out, that once you get below the top, this is India, there are many BJP mini political dynasties also. So no party in India is free of this curse, I'm sorry to say. So now coming back to this question of the
Modi rather than most of BJP.
So
that's fine.
So now, to come to the question of the two Modis, this is something that I've written about for years in the Wall Street Journal, which is that I've always said that you should not pay attention to what an Indian politician or technocrat says when he puts on a suit and goes to Davos. And I've learned this the hard way. You should pay attention to what that same politician says when he is wearing a kurta pajama and speaking in Hindi in the backwaters of Uttar Pradesh. If you want to understand what economic, and that is a good thing, that's not a bad thing, because in the end it's a democracy, and in the end what a politician says to their voters matters a lot more than what a politician says to a bunch of Westerners in suits. And that really explains the two Modis in Davos. So in Davos, he gave this speech, or if you sort of looked at his speech, it was almost like it was an echo of Xi Jinping's speech last year at Davos. It was sort of that we're at a moment where globalization is under threat, Trump making these anti-globalization noises, and India is going to step up because obviously globalization has been tremendously good for India in terms of helping it reduce poverty. But then you have the budget which sends exactly the opposite message. And the truth is that, very simply put, the votes in India are not going to be won based on what you say in Davos. The votes are going to be won based on another set of policies. And so I think that to me that's a very sort of simple explanation.
Okay, so Modi's copping criticism here for not fulfilling his free market reform pledges. But what about on the social front, Rahul? Modi's critics will often argue that Modi himself is personally responsible for the growing anti-Christian and anti-Muslim attitudes around India. What's your response to that?
Okay, that's a very, very interesting question, and I'm very happy to take that on. The thing is, there was a riot in India in 2002, and Prime Minister, at that time he was a Premier of the state. And there was a lot of media which actually just came out against him, saying that as a premier of the state, he did not do enough to basically stop the riots or do something else. In that one, the official figures are around 1,000 people died, out of which around 700 were Muslims, around 300 Hindus. So that was the line which was taken. So that thing, after 2002, in 2004, Congress party came to power. For the 10 years, they pursued him with every single inquiry which they could put up. Even an SIT, which is a Supreme Court constituted body, which grilled Modi as a premier of a state for at least 36 hours and still could not find any evidence of his involvement into that. Moreover, on top of that, after 2002, there was not even a single riot till date in 16 years which ever happened in Gujarat, the state he represented. Now, just to give you an idea, in the same state, in the Congress ruled 60 odd years, there were riots which were much more bigger and in which thousands and thousands of people died. In 1984, the biggest tragedy for the Sikhs in India, when Indira Gandhi was assassinated, and there were 3,000 Sikhs which were basically literally burnt in New Delhi by putting tires in their neck, burning tires. And my dear friend Manoj Shioran would definitely remember that Rajiv Gandhi at that time made a statement, Indira Gandhi's son, who was made the prime minister, that when big tree falls, earth shakes. Okay, now just to tell you about now coming back to the question of Modi being seen as anti-Christian or anti-Muslim. Now, Modi government started, and the reason they came to power in Uttar Pradesh was banning the triple talaq, which was the triple divorce, by saying 3 times divorce. The Muslim men in India would be able to basically divorce their wife by just uttering thrice. So Modi government brought a legislation, and Uttar Pradesh, that UP, in which the Muslim population is almost 25%, they won out of 400 seats, they won more than 320 seats, because the entire Muslim population, the women, they voted for Modi, okay, because they know that they have been misused, this decree has been misused against them a lot.
Okay, I have to
just 1 second. Let me finish. Let me finish, guys. Let me finish, guys. What has happened in India over the last 70 odd years? The leftist mindset and the vote bank politics of appeasing the minorities to make their vote share, that is what exactly happens in Australia too, unfortunately, where a section of society or a section of party basically tries to appease a particular section of voters so that they actually stay with them forever, okay? Just by slogans, but not doing the right thing. Modi has stopped that. Every single accusation which has been thrown in the last 4 years about demolishing mosques or trying to desecrate the churches, or some rape which happened with a rape accusation which was done in Calcutta with a nun. And what they have found is all those guys were either the leftist or the CPI, the Communist Party of India guys. So that has been proven in record. It's all in the newspapers.
Sadanand Dhume.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we're all entitled to our own opinions. We're not entitled to our own facts. And there is absolutely zero evidence to suggest that Muslim women voted overwhelmingly for the BJP. It's certainly true that the BJP scored a very big victory in Uttar Pradesh, where the Muslim population is about 18%, not 25%. And that's part because there was a consolidation of the Hindu vote across castes. There's zero evidence that the Muslims voted for the BJP. That's fine. You know, there are a lot of, the ethnic groups can choose their. I'm not saying that this necessarily, is sort of reflects poorly on the party, but it's simply untrue to claim that the BJP is hoovering up large numbers of Muslim female votes, because there's absolutely no data to support that. So that's my first point. The second point is that, I think that this is a much more complicated and delicate question than, that can be answered by taking party positions. The fact is that I would argue that there has been, Indian secularism is going through a crisis right now. And it's certainly true that in the traditional model of secularism that was followed from the time of Nehru in 1947, there was a tendency to ignore the radicalism that was on the Islamic side, because there was a sense that the Muslims were a small and vulnerable minority, and also there was a sense that because clerical authorities in the community had a very large political voice, it was better to stay clear of that. And that has been my long-standing criticism of the Congress and the Nehruvian brand of secularism. But this is not. One can accept that criticism while also accepting that there are genuine problems in the BJP's approach to these issues. And fundamentally, the problem really here is that if the left in India makes the mistake of not distinguishing between ordinary Muslims and Islamists, the right in India mistake of discriminating against in their rhetoric and in some of their policies towards ordinary Muslims who have nothing to do with extremism. And this is a genuine issue. It can't be swept under the carpet, and certainly shouldn't be sort of shouldn't be evaded or brushed over.
There is so much to say about India. We have to move on just quickly. I want to ask a question to Belish about one of the big issues in Australian politics right now is the controversy over this Adani mine. Now, there was an op-ed piece in the Financial Review last week by a chap named Danny Price, Managing Director of Frontier Economics, and he makes the point, and this is more or less the federal government's position and the Modi government's position. It's meeting stiff resistance, especially here in this country. Adani's coal will provide power for lights, clean water and jobs in India. We need sensible climate policy here before lecturing others. What's your sense of this Adani debate, and do you sense that this could lead to anti-Australian attitudes in India if we reject the bid?
Yeah, no, it can very well so actually. The thing is, the way it is being seen by Indian community in Australia, or for that matter, business community in India, is because I'm not a spokesperson of Adani as a company itself, but of course I would side with anything that is pro-progress for not only Australia but India as well. Now, Adani as a business is good for Australia, and that has been the stand of local people, indigenous people, and of course both sides of politics, Liberal and Labour. Before the Labour, for whatever political reason, it flipped. Now we see the more and more influence from Greens for their own political gain on locals as well as on Labour, and that is the reason why they flipped. Adani as a business, of course, it's good for local community. Of course, it's good for India-Australia ties, and of course, it is. You cannot on a developing nation like India, you cannot impose the restrictions of or the burden of bearing climate change and not using coal, whereas Australia and other developed countries have already enjoyed the fruit of using this energy for the last so many decades, and now we should bear the burden of using or emitting, like controlling carbon emission. I don't think that's fair. Coal being the cheapest source of power in Australia, and coal being a very feasible source of power in India, is very much instrumental for India's growth. But on that point, I would also like to add one more thing on Sadanand's point, that as he said, secularism in India is in danger right now. It's completely a biased opinion. Again, as he said, it's his opinion, and he is entitled to one. The problem is this, as he rightly mentioned, that Nehruvian secularism was siding towards minorities, especially an Islamic minority, and ignoring the problems of within Islam and Islamic terrorism. And that has led in last so many decades that marginalization of Islamic community within themselves, and that's why there is so much grudge, and that is one of the sign is number of states like Gujarat or UP, number of riots, small or big, and every year, number of states. Now BJP, and especially in Modi's model in Gujarat, and for that matter in nationally, is forget about Hindu, forget about Muslim, everyone is Indian. And his slogan, most popular and most effective one, is Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. He doesn't care whether you are Hindu or Muslim. And that is the reason, and that is the reason why Muslims have accepted him in Gujarat and others.
Now, I was just going to say that the broad cross-section of Indians are obviously Hindu Indians, but there is a population of, I think, 180 million Muslims or thereabouts.
Second largest.
It's the second largest population of Muslims in the world after Indonesia. Fascinating. Manoj.
Yeah. Now, my friend Balesh and Rahul are trying very hard to justify this. They're trying very hard to justify, but the reality is, Modi is a product of RSS. Yeah. What is RSS? RSS has got one ideology. They don't allow different views to work together, or different thoughts. That is one school of thought. So how are they trying their best to sort of defend that?
We don't need to try.
RSS, they only got one ideology. Now I will ask them a question. In UP and in Gujarat, let's say talk about UP. UP got a massive population of Muslim, and they did not give any tickets to contest election. Now where is that? So what is it? Now similarly in Gujarat, similar thing happened in Gujarat.
I'll answer that.
They don't want They
Yeah,
didn't
very
given
good.
any. So
If you stop,
RSS has got one school of thought, and they want to impose that school of thought to the whole country.
Okay. Now let me answer that. Let me
And
very
this is-
quickly answer
This is
that.
against.
Go.
This is against the Constitution of India.
Okay, let me just quickly
Democratic
answer.
values.
Rahul has a
So
role.
they're trying their
Very
best
quickly,
to defend
very
it, but I
quickly,
don't
let me
think
answer that.
it's happening.
In any democratic process, when you are fighting elections, you fight elections to win. You don't fight elections because you want to appease some particular portion of the community to make sure that is what you're doing. Let me just ask a very simple question from, no, let me just tell you, let me just finish first. When BJP came to power in 1999, BJP was the only one who appointed Abdul Kalam Azad as the president of India. Okay? They were the only one. When Congress came to power in 2004, Abdul Kalam Azad was still eligible to have another term. Most of the presidents in India, they go for 2 terms. But Congress party rejected him. Why? What was that? Number 2.
What did you
No,
do
no,
with
no,
Always Ansari, who was the vice president?
No, so he just
He was
retired.
supposed to be
No,
president.
he just
What you did with
retired.
them?
No, he just retired.
This is not
Anyway,
really
he
a
just
good
retired.
example.
So finally,
I don't agree with you.
finally, in here, there are 400,000 Indians living in Australia right now. Do you think that Indian Australians should stand up now and say, because we are 400,000, we are minority, give us a ticket? No. When someone is eligible, when someone proves their mettle, then only they should be getting a ticket, no matter what party they belong to. So that is the argument.
That's what I'm
Now,
saying.
it's time for Q&A,
Yeah.
and our first question will
That
come
doesn't
from
happen.
Adi
You need
Saksaria.
a
Our first question will come from Adi Saksaria. He's at Indian Politics Lively. Adi is an exchange student, Indian exchange student at the Australian National University, and we're delighted to say she was a summer intern here at CIS. Adi.
Since you, amazing discussion. It was really intriguing, the whole debate between all of you. Since the theme about the ideology of the BJP party came up, I was wondering if the panel could throw some light on, since Modi came into power, there were a lot of instances in India that happened that reflected the party's religious illiberalism when it came to, and also the party is touted to be very, very skeptical of Western values or accepting any of the Western ideologies. So, do you think that at any point there could be
What sort of incidents you are referring to?
religious intolerance when it came to a lot of the cow instances of people of the whole legislation coming about not eating cow, or people being lynched because of having a cow, or because being rumored to have, like, killing a cow. And Modi did not make a lot of very bold statements or like actions against these things. So do you think at any point the religious illiberalism of the party could cause a problem between the India and Australia engagement just because of Australia's value-based inclination?
Yeah. Okay, I'll just very quickly answer that. Cow slaughter is banned in India in every single state. It's in Indian constitution. You want to eat beef? India is the largest exporter of beef when we talk of beef, but we are talking of buffaloes and other meat, not the cow. So, if somebody has done something wrong,
Since when?
Since 1947, even before Nehru became the prime minister. Now, talking of intolerance and talking of Western ideology, let me just tell you, BJP is the only party, right-wing, center-of-right party in India which has joined UDF, United Democratic Front, which is all the liberal and all the right, center-of-right parties in the world, and that only happened after Modi became the prime minister. Third point which I want to make about intolerance, what it is what we get here is most of the time what the media wants you to know. The bad news always sell more than the good news, okay? So what we need to understand, if any of you who hasn't been to India, just please go and check it out. How tolerant the country is. There are more than 1,400 languages spoken in that country. All indigenous religions which have emanated from India had never had any riot in between them, whether they are Hindus, whether they are Jains, whether they are Sikhs, whether they are Buddhists, okay, and even with the Christians. So tolerance is not an issue. It has just been created to malign the BJP government for the simple reason to get people on one side because of vote bank politics, which has kept the Congress in power for the last 60 odd years, and that was the only reason. But we don't see any religious intolerance.
Next question from Professor Bruce McKern, formerly of Stanford University.
Thank you very much, Tom. I would like to address a question to the panel, and particularly to our first speaker, Sadanand, about the future. You raised at the beginning the question of China's power vis-à-vis India, and I agree with you that in order to be able to counter China's power, India has to have a stronger economic base. I have recently read a review, but I've not read the book yet, of a book by an Indian woman called Dreamers, and her name I think is Stignan Punan. And she is very pessimistic about the social impact of the inequality in China, in India, over the next few years. Something of the order of 500 new births will happen between now and 2050. And so India will have a very large demography, and a lot of people are very positive about the demographic dividend. But she speaks rather with great concern about rising senses of inequality and inability to get jobs and inability to have the kind of life that they've been aspiring to. So my question to you, I think, is, do you believe that there's a significant problem there? And how will government address it? Will India move in the direction of a government which is very much like the Chinese government, a single-party government which appears to be able to get things done?
Sadanand.
That's an absolutely fantastic question. I'm afraid I don't have a good answer, but I'll take a stab at it. You know, the demographic question in many ways is a simple question, because when you look at India in a glass half full way, it really is about, to a large extent, the young demography and the fact that, you know, when you look at at a pyramid, India is going to have many more people at a working age and relatively few people who are of a retirement, who are past retirement. But the flip side of the demographic dividend is precisely this. For this to work out, you have to find ways to ensure that that young population is productively employed, which is why the economic question has been so central. To add another wrinkle to this, if you look at India, if you look across the country, the parts of India that are more prosperous, the parts of India that are more prosperous and generally better governed along the western and southern coasts are also the places where, generally speaking, they have reached replacement levels of fertility. And the parts of India that are least well governed and with the lowest rates of literacy and the least job creation are the ones that are of the Hindi heartland, for instance, where birth rates are not expected to reach replacement levels for another 100 years or longer. So I think it's a genuine, it's a central question the country is going to have to grapple with it. I'm not in a position to say whether Indian politics is going to evolve in a Chinese direction, but I think it's a very good question, and I think that at some point, whoever is in power, you know, whether it's Modi or someone else, they have to come to grips with this, because unless you can get the economy to start delivering jobs, you're going to get a situation where you have many young people who are, who on television and in movies and so on, have aspirations that are much greater than their parents and grandparents. I'll give you one quick anecdote before I sort of wrap up this question. You know, I was talking to someone in Delhi a couple of weeks ago, and who was telling me how horrible his life was. And I asked this person about, you know, how much he had studied. He'd studied till 5th grade, and whether he had, when he had grown up, whether he'd had a television or a refrigerator or a mobile phone. And he said he'd had none of these things. He had all of them now. He expected his children to go to university. And so then I said, well, how can you possibly say that your life is worse? And he says that, well, you know, the aspirations are so much greater. And the gap between aspirations and what the economy is going to deliver is absolutely the
central question. And I would say that this is what all politicians and all political parties are dealing with.
One more question. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Pavan Luthra, Indian Link.
Thank you.
Sadanand, good to see you. You were here about 3 years ago. And at that time, when the Modi government had just come into power, you had said that the BJP government was a party of opportunity. Do you still think it is the party of opportunity, or has it lost its way? Number two, which I wanted to check with you, was that on the foreign policy front, China has been quite aggressive in its international politics. South China Sea, the One Belt, One Road policy, setting up a naval base in Sri Lanka. Has the Modi government in the past 4 years been outplayed by China in international affairs?
Two very good questions. I would certainly say from my comments that the BJP has not lived up to my expectations of being a government of opportunity. And I think it has not been a true successor to the last BJP government between 1998 and 2004, which really was one of the most reformist governments India had seen. So we've seen the BJP move to the left on economics compared to its own past and not live up to the expectations of reform. Hope springs eternal, and I hope that we're right, and post-2019 something is different. But based on the evidence so far, they have certainly not lived up to expectations. On China, I think the government has actually done a good job. I mean, I think what's happening here is that as China becomes more and more aggressive, not just in the South China Sea, but in the Indian Ocean, the fact is that India is being forced to play defense. This is not the fault of any particular Indian government. This is just simply a reality that China has become more influential today in Sri Lanka than it was earlier. I was just there, I saw the Prime Minister. You can see Chinese construction all over the island. Similarly, China has made inroads into the Maldives, which was earlier a country that was, more or less in terms of its foreign policy outlook, fixed firmly on India. You say a similar story in Nepal and around India's periphery. So it's certainly true that China has become a much more influential and important player in South Asia than it was 4 years ago. But that is simply that is for reasons that are out of India's control. That's a reflection of its economic might, and it's a reflection of Xi Jinping's more forward-leaning aggressive policies. I think the Modi government has, under those circumstances, played its cards quite well. You saw, for example, in 2016 in Doklam, it refused to be cowed by the Chinese. This is a disputed territory in Bhutan, which was claimed by both Bhutan and China, and has great strategic importance for India. And for several weeks, Indian and Chinese troops were eyeball to eyeball in the Himalayas, and India did not blink. So I think that showed great resolve. I think that the diplomatic strategy in terms of reaching out to the United States, deepening relations with Japan, deepening relations with Australia,
This is the Quad,
resurrecting the Quad. So I think that the government has played its diplomatic hand quite well, but it is on the back foot.
And Sudan, on that note, will the Indian government give up its misgivings about having a security partnership with Australia, given what Kevin Rudd did to India in 2008 on the Quad? And nuclear energy, by the way.
India doesn't do formal alliances. I think the fact that that India was skeptical about the Quad because the previous Australian Labor government was had pulled out, and India sort of sees, rightly or wrongly, many Indians see Australia as the weak link in the Quad because of its very close economic relationship with China.
Yeah.
But the fact is the Quad is back, so let's see.
Okay, we are running out of time. One last
I'll
question,
try and be
sir.
quick. Some of the negative comments made about the Modi's economic initiatives truly disturbs me, given that we've missed the elephant in the room. We're in unprecedented economic times due to quantitative easing causing huge disjoint between the rich and poor worldwide. And at least India has made the first attempt at trying to do something about that disjoint, trying to use social economics, with the world's biggest democracy. Can anyone comment?
What is social economics?
Well, trying to create and break up that disjoint between the rich and poor, trying a better distribution structure, introducing taxation system that's more effective, introducing policies that will create a better balance, which is what's needed in the world. Because the biggest issue in the world right now is the disjoint between rich and poor caused by pure monetary printing and inflating assets at the expense of people trying to live a lifestyle.
So I'll kick a quick stab at that. First of all, I don't see any evidence of such policies. Secondly, I think that the major thing that India faces is to completely eliminate poverty. It's made great strides in the last 25 years. And the key to that, which we've seen in the example of China and East Asia, is growth. So at this stage of India's economic development, it needs to be focused on growth, and it needs to be focused on job creation. And the only way it's going to get to faster growth and greater job creation is by getting rid of some of the hurdles that were placed over decades of socialism. And for that, you need a strong and decisive leader. India has a strong and decisive leader. Unfortunately, he has not been strong and decisive in these departments.
Okay, now we are running out of time. I want to thank the panel, but before we do that, I want to introduce a board member to do the vote of thanks. Centre for Independent Studies has a very distinguished board of directors, mainly entrepreneurs and businessmen and women, no more so than our next speaker. And James Phillips, our board member, will give the vote of thanks. Welcome, James.
Thanks, Tom. I guess it's a sad fact of history that the dominant independence ideology on offer in the early to mid 20th century was leftist, and that's led to some degree to the stultification of some of the economies in newly independent countries. It's very exciting to see India moving away from that legacy since the early 1990s. I must have been extremely young at the time, but my first trip to India was when I was it was in the 1980s, and since then I've only been back once with my family about 15 years ago with my young sons and wife, and the transformation even in that period between the mid-80s when everything felt completely stultified and more or less inert, and the energy that was around even 15 years ago was just remarkable. I've also had the opportunity to do some business with Indian companies, including in Australia. I have to make another, I don't want this to be a bashing of our cultural elite exercise, but I do have to make the point that it also seems to me a bit of a tragedy that when you make points in the context of what we now call the Carmichael mine, because polling has shown that Adani now has a negative connotation. The Carmichael mine, if you make the point that 25% of Indian households are still without electricity, and that the biggest cause of death from pollution in the world today is actually indoor pollution from families living in extreme poverty who can't afford any electrification and who live in smoke generated by the little fires they have to do their cooking, and their only source of heat, no chimneys. If you make those sort of points to some of our cultural elite as a counterpoint to the issues around CO2 emissions, unfortunately you don't get any traction whatsoever. And I think that's a bit of a tragedy. In any event, thank you so much to our speakers this evening. It was a very interesting panel, very well constructed, Tom, with some of the, as I say, the more neutral, albeit coming from American Enterprise Institute, sort of perspective, commentary to set up the discussion, and then some good partisan spice in the discussion subsequently. So for me, fascinating discussion, and one which I think at the CIS we're thrilled to have facilitated this evening. And we do very much hope as well that some of you for whom this is your first time at the CIS, that you'll show some interest in us. One of the wonderful things about the Indian community in Australia is how enterprising it is and what a wonderful contribution it's making to the Australian economy as well as to other aspects of our lives. And I think you'd find that the CIS shares values with many people in your community. So thank you all very much for your participation in this event this evening.